Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by congratulating President Grimson for the excellent initiative of convening this first Arctic Circle meeting. I look forward to developing as a fundamental forum for cooperation, but also as an interface between the world of the Arctic and the world out there that is concerned by development in the Arctic in the future. We are very excited to be part of this opening meeting and very much hope to cooperate further in the future. I have a very simple message this morning, and that is that there is no predetermined future development for the Arctic. The way in which the Arctic develops can go towards a sustainable path, or it can go towards a destructive path. And the difference between the two depends very much on the policy framework that is put in place. Hillary Clinton scooped me this morning when she talked about the importance of the rules of the game, but she's absolutely right. The Arctic is changing. The Arctic faces both challenges and opportunities. How it responds to those opportunities and what rules of the game determine the future of this region is absolutely fundamental. Yes. We all know that the Arctic is on the cusp of a very important and rapid change. And the challenge is to ensure that the kind of change that occurs is to the benefit of the Arctic communities. It's a challenge because the pace of change is absolutely enormous. We saw from the earlier presentation the rate at which changes are taking place in the Arctic environment. But it's also an opportunity for the Arctic because it opens up chances for economic development that didn't exist before. And the momentum for that is already building very strongly. But it requires very concerted international cooperation to put in place the regulatory and policy framework that will ensure that those economic benefits actually accrue to the communities. The climate change in the Arctic is the context. It is, as we know, the area of the world that is most seriously affected by the changing climate. And if we had any residual doubts about that, they were put to rest late last month with the publication of the latest IPCC report. We know that action has to be taken in the Arctic to deal with the effects of climate change. But we also know that it is essentially outside the Arctic that the future of this region will be determined because of climate change. I want to give you an example of the policy framework that I'm talking about. And the example that I've picked is the subsidies to fossil fuels. We know that climate change is being driven by cheap access to fossil energy, and that the price of fossil energy is being artificially lowered by subsidies applied to fossil fuels all around the world and in many countries. We still subsidize the consumption and production of fossil fuels to an enormous extent. You probably don't know, but the estimates of the amount of fossil fuels range between $600 billion a year and $2 trillion, and of course the difference depends on how you define subsidies and what subsidies you take into account. But the worst thing is that those subsidies tend to be misaligned so that the policy purpose for which they were put in place is not actually served by the subsidies themselves. So an enormous amount of public money is being spent, but it's being spent in ways that don't even meet the public policy purpose for which they were put in place, and at the same time accelerate climate change. Arctic countries are not exempt from using subsidies. The three examples I put up here, and I warn you that the numbers are not all that comparable because there is no international benchmark for calculating the extent of subsidies. But this just goes to show that there are billions of dollars being spent in support of exploration and production of fossil fuels, and that money is spent at a great opportunity cost because it's money that could be used for other purposes. There will be a big temptation, I think, to subsidize rapid resource exploitation in the Arctic because the risks are great, because the uncertainties are great, and corporations will not wish to venture into the Arctic without some form of government support and guarantee. And the form that that support takes will determine to a very large extent the way in which Arctic development proceeds. There is no predetermined law saying that that support needs to go directly to the corporations for their exploration and production activities. The same public funding could be used to encourage sustainable development and not add to the burden of climate change, for example, through public support to renewable energy, through skills development, through the creation of development funds for Arctic communities, for the development of institutions. That is the choice that we face. Beyond subsidies, a lot of what happens in the Arctic will depend on the frameworks put in place to govern investments. The investors operate under agreements, bilateral agreements, contracts, and others, and the actual content of those agreements and the way in which disputes are addressed to a very large extent will determine whether development goes in a sustainable way or whether it doesn't. We need to ensure that investors not only have their rights protected, but that there's a clear articulation of their responsibilities as well. That in investing in development in the Arctic, they're not only investing in increasing their bottom line, but they're investing in the sustainable development of Arctic societies, of Arctic communities. And we need to ensure that investment agreements do not undermine that move as they do in many other parts of the world. And to make sure of that, there are a number of instruments already available. For example, the Model Mineral Development Agreement that's been applied in several countries around the world, which tries to ensure a balance between investor rights protection and the articulation of investor responsibilities. It's quite clear that the opportunity to act is now. Development in the Arctic, or at least large-scale energy and mineral exploitation, is taking place, but it's only just beginning. The opportunity exists to put in place a policy framework, a regulatory framework, as Hillary Clinton called it, the rules of the game, that will steer development in the Arctic, that will steer investment into the Arctic into sustainable channels, to ensure that what we get from all this effort is the kind of Arctic development in the Arctic that will benefit the communities, that will protect their traditional ways of life, that will meet their expectations and those of future generations. For this to happen, the decisions cannot only be taken among Arctic countries. We need, and the fossil fuel subsidy example shows it, we need concerted international cooperation to ensure that the investment, that the public support to development in the Arctic pushes that development into sustainable channels. We see the Arctic Circle as a very important forum to gather and draw upon the best of experience from around the world, the best practices put in place by corporations, by communities, by countries, and to ensure that there is an interface between that experience from elsewhere and the requirements of the Arctic. We see the Arctic Circle playing an extremely important role in that regard and look forward to collaborating with you in it. Thank you.